On March 6, 2024, the Egyptian pound experienced a dramatic devaluation, dropping by 40% in a single day. Initially perceived as a national disaster, it unexpectedly became a benefit for foreign tourists. Prior to this, Egypt had been grappling with severe black market exchange rates, economic collapse, a middle class descending into poverty, long lines of desperate job seekers, and the wealthy moving their assets abroad. Egypt, the ancient civilization that built the pyramids, the Mediterranean's richest granary under Roman rule, and the Suez Canal hub fiercely defended by Churchill, has now fallen into economic turmoil. Throughout the 20th century, Egypt's per capita GDP was consistently higher than China's. In 1982, Egypt's per capita GDP was 3 times that of China, and it wasn't until 2001 that China surpassed Egypt. How did Egypt, once on the path to revival, end up in its current state? Let me tell you the story. Western media often depicted him as either a madman or a nouveau riche who amassed his fortune through luck and deceit. The Sunday Times claimed he had at least £1.7 billion of wealth with unclear origins. In 1985, he made headlines by acquiring the historic British department store Harrods, much to the dismay of the British public. A year later, he purchased an antique villa in Paris, once the love nest of former King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, the American woman for whom the king abdicated the throne, creating quite a sensation. What irritated the British most was that this millionaire was an Egyptian, a member of the inferior race they had colonized and oppressed a century earlier. Born on January 27, 1929, in Alexandria, Egypt, Al-Fayed first made the news in 1985 with his Harrods acquisition. He claimed to come from a wealthy upper-class Egyptian family with extensive business networks. A background check by the UK's Department of Trade and Industry revealed that Al-Fayed's father, Ali Al-Fayed, was merely a primary school teacher. Al-Fayed himself began his career selling sewing machines and lemonade before venturing into shipping. His claims of an affluent family background were fabrications. But why did he feel the need to falsify his origins? Egypt once boasted a glorious ancient civilization, known for its world-renowned symbols like the pyramids, the Sphinx, temples, and obelisks. This era spanned from around 2600 BCE to 525 BCE. Over time, Egypt was repeatedly conquered by foreign invaders, and its ancient civilization eventually perished, leaving only remnants behind. By the late 18th century, when Westerners came to exploit the region, Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire. In 1805, an unruly Ottoman governor named Muhammad Ali declared himself king. Widely recognized as the father of modern Egypt, Muhammad Ali championed the development of industry and commerce, the establishment of a modern military, national institutions, and the cultivation of agriculture. However, after Muhammad Ali's death, his descendants failed to uphold his legacy. During this time, Egypt was invaded and colonized by France in 1798 and by Britain in 1882. It wasn't until 1952, when Nasser led a revolution, that Ali's dynasty was completely overthrown and the colonizers were expelled. When Al-Fayed was born in 1929, Egypt was still under British colonial rule. At his birth, Alexandria had a population of around 500,000, with about 50,000 foreigners living in grand buildings and gardens by the sea. Meanwhile, most Egyptians, including poor local Muslims and low-wage migrant workers, lived scattered throughout the rest of the city. Alexandria, a renowned ancient city built during the Ptolemaic dynasty, was located by the Mediterranean Sea and had a thriving commercial port, making it the second largest city in Egypt after Cairo. Under colonial rule, the distinction between Westerners and locals in Alexandria was stark. Most local Egyptians wore tattered clothes and struggled to find enough to eat, while Westerners enjoyed a life of luxury, attending balls and playing polo in silk and satin attire. Egyptians resented the Western colonizers but also envied their leisurely, affluent, and dignified lifestyle. Al-Fayed's fabrication of his background partly stemmed from this ambivalent mindset, both resentful and yearning for British recognition. In fact, even the most ordinary British family could live like royalty in Egypt at that time. In 1910, a 20-year-old British woman accompanied her ailing mother to Egypt for health reasons. In her autobiography, she wrote, "Fortunately, the cost of traveling to Egypt was quite low, just the rent from Ashfield was enough to cover it." Ashfield was not considered a prime commercial area in Britain, yet the rent from such a remote region was sufficient to cover all their expenses in Egypt, including flirting, attending balls, and playing polo. The young woman continued to write with enthusiasm. "These 3 months were absolutely wonderful. I met at least 20 or 30 young men and attended around 50 or 60 parties." By 1929, this British woman had matured into a middle-aged lady. Having just signed her divorce papers, she returned to Egypt to heal from the pain of separation and stayed at the Old Cataract Hotel in Aswan, built by Thomas Cook, the father of modern tourism. In this luxurious hotel, she found inspiration to write the world-famous detective novel Death on the Nile and even fell in love again with an archaeologist 14 years her junior, blossoming into a new chapter of her life. While the colonizers indulged in their romances and fantasies, they naturally overlooked the hardships faced by impoverished Egyptians beneath the surface of luxury. This neglect inevitably fostered resistance. In 1918, after World War I ended, Britain placed Egypt under its mandate. That same year, in a working-class neighborhood of Alexandria, one of modern Egypt's most fervent anti-colonial activists was born, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser's father was a low-ranking postal worker in Alexandria. In 1923, young Nasser was sent to live with his uncle Khalil in Cairo. Khalil was a passionate nationalist who despised the oppressive British lords and had even been imprisoned for participating in protests. Influenced by his uncle, Nasser developed a strong anti-colonial consciousness from an early age. However, resisting British rule was no easy feat. When the British first invaded Egypt in 1882, they claimed to bring civilization, branding Egypt as barbaric. From then on, the British held guns in one hand and lectured the Egyptians on civilization with the other. In March 1919, Cairo witnessed an unprecedented anti-colonial uprising. Thousands of Egyptian students, workers, and farmers went on strike, taking to the streets and shouting, "Egypt for Egyptians," only to be met with brutal suppression. The streets of Cairo ran red with blood, and around 3,000 people perished, including children holding national flags. Simultaneously, a bookish colonial government official named Saad Zaghloul led a delegation of Egyptians to Britain, hoping to negotiate independence through eloquence. They also secretly attended the 1919 Paris Peace Conference to proclaim Egypt's desire for independence to the world. The delegation, known as the Wafd in Arabic, gave rise to the Wafd Party, which remains active in Egyptian politics today. Despite being hailed as a national hero upon his return to Egypt, Zaghloul came back empty-handed and was soon arrested by colonial authorities. This arrest sparked another wave of protests. Reluctantly, in 1922, the British formally recognized Egypt's independence. In 1923, a constitution was enacted, declaring Egypt a constitutional monarchy with a parliament. The Wafd Party won 90% of the seats, and Zaghloul became prime minister. However, the British imposed 4 conditions while granting independence, ensuring British interests in the Suez Canal, extraterritorial rights, the right to station troops, and maintaining King Fuad I, a descendant of Muhammad Ali, to uphold puppet colonial rule. The British retained the right to station troops and ensured the position of King Fuad I to maintain a puppet colonial rule. In 1924, the assassination of British Commander-in-Chief Lee Stack in Egypt prompted the British to dissolve the parliament and abolish the 1923 constitution. Zaghloul was deposed after only 9 months as prime minister. Subsequently, the parliament became a mere facade, frequently dissolved, and the Wafd Party fell into division and degeneration. On August 27, 1927, a heartbroken Zaghloul passed away. Thousands of grieving Egyptians flooded the streets of Cairo for his funeral, causing a standstill. A 9-year-old Nasser witnessed the sea of people and later recalled the thought that crossed his mind: "Whenever I saw planes flying overhead, I would shout, 'Oh, Almighty God, may disaster befall them.'" From that moment, the seeds of a soldier were sown in the heart of this child from Alexandria's working-class neighborhood. In 1935, a young Nasser, then president of the Cairo Student Union, led anti-British protests. During one demonstration, he clashed with the police, resulting in the deaths of 2 classmates and a bullet graze on his forehead, leaving a lifelong scar. That year, he visited various nationalist organizations, including the Wafd Party, the Young Egypt Party, and the Muslim Brotherhood founded by Hassan al-Banna, hoping to unite them for a common cause. After visiting these organizations, he found them either weak and ineffective or veering towards fundamentalism and terrorism, rendering them useless. In a letter to his classmates, he sorrowfully lamented, "The nation is heading towards ruin. Where are those willing to sacrifice for our country's independence? Where are the people who will help the oppressed and humiliated Egyptians rise again? Where is our dignity? Where is our national spirit?" In 1936, his despair deepened. That year, several nationalist organizations, including the Wafd Party, united and signed the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty with the British, legally confirming Britain's right to station troops along the Suez. This realization plunged Nasser into deep despair. He understood that shouting alone is not power, and that he needed weapons and his own army. In the same year, he enrolled in the Royal Military Academy in Cairo, marking the start of his military career. There, he not only joined the military successfully but also met 6 close friends, including fellow commoner Anwar Sadat and the royal relative with revolutionary intentions, Abdul Hakim America. Together, they founded the secret organization Free Officers. Joining the army was Nasser's first step towards revolution, but the newly formed Free Officers organization initially had limited strength and made inevitable mistakes. The biggest mistake occurred during World War II when Sadat, one of the founders, collaborated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which followed Islamic fundamentalism and was involved in terrorist assassinations. However, the passionate Sadat was eventually betrayed by the Brotherhood's founder, Hassan al-Banna, and the coup failed before it even began. Later, Sadat was arrested for assisting Nazi spies and spent over 2 years in prison. This episode proved that trying to save the country by conspiring with dangerous elements was like drinking poison to quench thirst, and was not the right path. In 1948, several Arab nations united to try to crush the newly established Israel, leading to the outbreak of the First Arab-Israeli War. This war ended in a disastrous defeat for the Arab nations, but for the Free Officers organization, it was a period of growth. They expanded from the initial 7 members to 1,000, and Nasser's outstanding performance in the war earned him high prestige and greatly increased his influence. Additionally, a veteran with extraordinary battlefield performance and high reputation was brought into the group by Nasser and his young comrades, serving as a beacon to attract more like-minded youth. This person was Mohammad Naguib. Known for his integrity and high reputation, Naguib once took on an alias during the war and exposed the emperor's corruption. Despite their efforts, the Free Officers were still too weak. They operated a makeshift underground weapons factory, which, due to lack of funds, used discarded Coca-Cola bottles as raw materials. Their goal was to quickly overthrow the regime, but they lacked the necessary resources and strength. As a result, they devised a poorly thought-out plan to target the king and several high-ranking officials. Naguib later recalled with regret, "After hearing the distressing sounds, I immediately felt remorse. Consequently, the covert plan was decisively abandoned." Sadat described this period as one of their most intense activities, involving an unusual act towards the leader. The wrong path could not be taken, and the right path was hard to follow, making the revolutionary cause seem to be at an impasse. However, history later proved that they didn't need to take drastic action, they just had to wait for the colonial regime to collapse on its own. Egypt, having experienced significant conflicts, was in a state of turmoil, with various factions vying for control and causing widespread instability. In the summer of 1948, even before the war had ended, large-scale unrest broke out in Alexandria, leading to the mass detention of numerous individuals by the government. In November, following news of military defeat, more unrest erupted, causing significant property damage and affecting many people. During this period, the Muslim Brotherhood, known for its terrorist activities, acted heroically on the battlefield while engaging in wanton behavior during domestic unrest. After the November unrest, the then Prime Minister declared the group a terrorist organization and disbanded it. 3 weeks later, he was assassinated by the group. His successor took retaliatory measures, leading to the arrest and detention of many group members. The entire country was in chaos, marked by daily killings and conflicts. King Farouk had long lost his royal authority. Besides embezzling funds from arms deals, he was plagued by numerous rumors portraying him as a thief, glutton, lecher, and murderer. It was said that he invited a master thief from prison to teach him how to steal and that he had stolen from visiting dignitaries like Churchill and the funeral entourage of the Iranian king. Allegedly, his daily breakfast consisted of 12 eggs, lunch included 40 quails, and he drank 30 bottles of beer each day, earning him the nickname Walking Food Barrel. He was also accused of forcibly taking married women, speeding through Cairo, and shooting anyone who overtook him. In summary, the king was widely regarded as a fool, one of the few points of consensus among the Egyptian people. By the 1950s, the Wafd Party had completely lost its early anti-colonial spirit and had become increasingly complicit with the British and the king. Under the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, the British retained a military presence in the Suez Canal zone. The Wafd Party, afraid to openly resist the British, resorted to covert tactics, such as banning the supply of labor and materials to British forces in the Suez Canal zone and encouraging students. This provoked fierce retaliation from the British, resulting in incidents like the bombing of 50 houses in an Egyptian village, displacing dozens of families, and another attack that killed 41 Egyptians. The king, frightened by these events, blamed the Wafd Party for being reckless and then tried to appease the British, which only fueled greater anger among Egyptians. This led to a massive fire in Cairo, where all buildings associated with the British were looted and burned. The Barclays Bank building and over 700 other structures were destroyed, the smoke covering the entire city. The incident, known as Black Saturday, on January 26, 1952, resulted in the deaths of 17 Europeans and 55 Egyptians. Endless unrest, conflicts, and rumors made the puppet government as fragile as a straw hut. During this time, the Free Officers Organization infiltrated key military positions, secretly colluded with palace officials, and stockpiled a large number of weapons and ammunition, planning a coup. However, despite their efforts, fate had other plans. In December 1951, the opposition led by Naguib won the election for the Management Committee of the Egyptian Officers Club, a key indicator of military loyalty to the king. Naguib's victory and the opposition's win aroused King Farouk's suspicion. In July 1952, he personally intervened, forcibly removing Naguib from his position and dissolving the club. This was a dangerous signal, prompting Ammar to warn his fellow free officers, "The king has dealt us a heavy blow. If we do not retaliate, our organization will quickly lose credibility among officers, and no one will dare to join us. If we do not act now, we will all end up in jail." On July 22, 1952, the king and his cabinet went to Alexandria for a summer retreat, leaving Cairo under military control. This presented the perfect opportunity for a coup, and the free officers decided to act immediately. Naguib recalled, "The weather was so hot and humid that no one but us could imagine a revolution was about to happen. A coup is a highly risky venture, failure could mean certain death for the conspirators." On the day of the coup, Naguib was warned by a subordinate that he was about to be arrested for involvement in an anti-government plot. This warning frightened him so much that he didn't dare leave his house. Meanwhile, Sadat created an alibi by taking his wife to the cinema, where he deliberately got into a scuffle with another audience member and then went to the police station to file a report. Nasser and Ammar, directly involved in the coup, wore civilian clothes. Despite these precautions, all actions proceeded according to plan. The officers first simultaneously took control of the radio station and the military headquarters. They then mobilized the troops loyal to the coup planners and took measures to ensure public safety and peace. At 2 a.m. the next morning, while most of Cairo was still asleep, Sadat arrived at the national radio station and, in the name of the Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief Naguib, announced the success of the coup. On the day of the coup, all the conspirators met, and the entire process went surprisingly smoothly, encountering almost no resistance. It was one of the few bloodless revolutions in modern history. Nawal el-Saadawi, a renowned female writer working in a hospital in downtown Cairo at the time, recalled, when the news of the successful coup came through the radio, patients shouted, "Long live the revolution." A funeral procession passing by the hospital also came to a halt. The men carrying the coffin placed it in the corridor and joined the crowd, shouting, "Long live the revolution." Women who had been wailing for the deceased began to cheer joyfully. King Farouk, having completely lost the support of the people, was bewildered and did not resist. That afternoon, he signed the abdication decree, with his only request being to leave with dignity. As he departed Cairo on a royal yacht, he was given a 21-gun salute, accompanied by his family and over 200 large boxes filled with personal belongings. Naguib had a brief and awkward farewell with Farouk. The deposed king's last words were, "You know, ruling Egypt is not an easy task." After the king's abdication, the Egyptian people showed no mercy. They established July 26, the day of his departure, as a permanent holiday, celebrated annually. The port of Alexandria, from where he left, turned into a festive scene. On July 26, 1956, after 4 years of complex power struggles, during which Naguib was ousted for allegedly conspiring with the Muslim Brotherhood to assassinate Nasser, now the president of Egypt, announced a major decision. Sadat, suffering from acute enteritis that day, had to apologize for not being able to attend but promised to listen to the live broadcast. He sensed something unusual but did not dwell on it. Around 7:40 p.m., as the radio broadcasted the speech, Sadat, lying in bed, was so shocked that he sat up despite his illness, breaking out in a cold sweat. It was a historic and highly dramatic speech. The theme of Nasser's speech was rather ordinary, but at the end, he announced a decision perhaps even more significant than the coup itself, the early nationalization of the Suez Canal. Strangely, Sadat had not been informed of such a major decision beforehand. However, he knew very well that the consequence of this decision could be summed up in 2 words: war. In the 15th century, after the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the Turks' capture of Constantinople, land routes for east-west trade were blocked, making the opening of a sea route imperative. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa to reach India, successfully establishing a new maritime route, although it was long dominated by the British and other European powers. In the late 18th century, France led a bourgeois revolution and established a republic, while surrounding monarchies, including Britain, united to suppress it. During this tumultuous time, the 5 feet 2 inches Frenchman Napoleon had a sudden insight: the British dominate the world because they control the trade routes to India. If we can control Egypt and open the Suez Canal, we can render the Cape of Good Hope route obsolete. However, the political situation in France changed dramatically. Napoleon, who had already conquered Egypt, was urgently recalled to France, and the canal excavation plan was shelved. Nevertheless, Napoleon managed to bring back a few artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, and later received an obelisk as a gift. This inadvertently ushered in a new era of archaeology. In the 19th century, a French diplomat named Martin de Lesseps emerged. Stationed in Egypt, he became a close friend of Muhammad Ali, who had helped Ali in his bid for the throne. Martin's son, Ferdinand de Lesseps, later took over his father's diplomatic position in Egypt. Muhammad Ali's son, Said Pasha, succeeded him as the ruler of Egypt. said Pasha was an ambitious man and, as a family friend of Ferdinand de Lesseps, was easily persuaded. In 1854, they signed a contract to build the Suez Canal. Egypt would provide the labor and land, while France would supply the technology and funding, holding more than half the shares. The canal would be operated and developed for 99 years before reverting to Egypt. In 1859, construction officially began. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptians participated in this monumental and arduous project. They toiled with primitive tools, endured long hours, had meager food, no medical care, faced extreme heat, scarce fresh water, and relentless sandstorms. Day after day, year after year, 120,000 Egyptians sacrificed their lives over 10 years, and by 1866, the canal was successfully opened. Nasser aptly stated, "This canal is our lifeblood, forged with our sweat and our bones." By 1875, the new Egyptian ruler Ismail, a grandson of Muhammad Ali, was ambitious but inept. Ismail's expansionist policies drained the treasury, forcing him to sell the royal family's 176,602 shares in the canal for 100 million francs, £400,000, to the British government. With an additional 400,000 shares acquired in 1924, the British government held 44% of the canal's shares. Although French shares were dispersed among various private companies, the British effectively controlled the canal's operations. Recognizing its strategic importance, the British invaded Egypt in 1882 under the pretext of protecting the canal, establishing their largest overseas military base with nearly 100,000 troops. When Nasser announced the nationalization of the canal, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was stunned, lamenting, "The lifeline of Britain is about to be severed." Eden's wife was Winston Churchill's niece. During World War II, Eden served as the British Army and Defence Minister, embodying the old aristocratic spirit. He spent his life defending the remnants of the British Empire. When Egypt declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal, he felt as if he could hear the old British ship creaking and about to sink. Eden knew that Britain couldn't stop Egypt from taking control, but he believed it was imperative to maintain the last vestige of British dignity in the New World Order. At that time, only two new superpowers could dominate the world, the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1954, under international anti-colonial pressure, Britain agreed to withdraw all troops from the Suez Canal within 2 years and to return control of the canal to Egypt 7 years later. By July 26, 1956, just 2 months before Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal, the British had already withdrawn all their troops. However, it was evident that the British were reluctant to let go completely. Their declining power left them no choice but to turn to the real global superpower at the time, the United States, to maintain justice. The question was, how to get the United States involved? By 1955, the anxious British had found a breakthrough, the Soviet Union. Their strategy was to repeatedly warn the Americans that if Western powers withdrew from the Middle East, a vacuum would be created, which the Soviet Union would then fill, altering the global balance of power. This tactic had been used by France's Charles de Gaulle to maintain control over colonial Vietnam, successfully dragging the US into a prolonged and costly conflict. The first step in the British maneuver was to sign a collective defense treaty with Turkey, Pakistan, and Iraq, known as the Baghdad Pact. The purpose was to counter the Soviet Union. The next step was to coax Egypt into joining. Egypt, inexperienced in such matters, was unsure how to proceed, sometimes trying to appease the British, other times fearing they might fall into a trap, and also wary of upsetting the Soviets, leading to confusion. This hesitation was exactly what the British wanted, as it would alarm the Soviet Union, prompting it to intervene, which in turn would make the US anxious, allowing the British to benefit from the ensuing tension. Would the British succeed? Initially, the US fully supported the anti-Soviet stance. Nasser's first reaction was to refuse joining the Baghdad Pact but left room for negotiation. He suggested that if the US and Britain funded the Aswan Dam's construction and sold advanced weapons, he might reconsider. The US and Britain, seeing this as an attempt to leverage them for benefits, agreed but insisted Egypt sign the treaty first. Unhappy with this, Nasser rallied his Arab allies, urging them not to sign the Baghdad Pact unless they received more concessions from the West. However, this plan faced obstacles. Nouri al-Said of Iraq, a staunch supporter of the West, believed Nasser was risking too much by challenging them. He argued that without Western support, the Arab nations would be defenseless. Additionally, Jordan and Lebanon, swayed by British persuasion, signed the Baghdad Pact without consulting Nasser. This displeased him, leading to accusations of dishonorable conduct against the US and Britain. At this point, Israel added to the tension. Founded in 1948, Israel had initially clashed with the British and sought arms from France. Later, recognizing the US as the new global leader, Israel aligned closely with America. When Israel saw the US and Britain showering the Middle East, particularly Egypt, with money and weapons, it became anxious, fearing a strengthened Middle East could threaten its existence. In one incident, Israeli agents disguised as Egyptian terrorists attacked the US consulate in Alexandria. When the truth came out, Egypt informed the US, causing embarrassment for Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who subsequently dismissed his defense minister, Pinhas Lavon. Despite this, Israel continued to purchase advanced weapons from France and frequently harassed Egypt's borders. This action enraged Nasser, who urgently needed advanced weaponry to retaliate. In 1955, he summoned British Ambassador Stevenson, angrily threw a stack of weapons purchase orders on the table, and demanded, "Where are the weapons you promised Egypt? If we're talking about collective defense, you should at least ensure we have military parity with Israel, right?" He then warned, "Tell Eden that if the US and Britain can't provide weapons, I'll have to turn to the Soviet Union." The British responded, "We have plenty of advanced weapons, but you need to sign the Baghdad Pact first." Increasingly frustrated, Nasser felt that the US and Britain were just stringing him along. In April 1955, the Bandung Conference was held, and Nasser was invited to participate. Just 2 months later, in June 1955, Nasser struck a deal with the Soviet Union for arms and ensured the US ambassador in Cairo was informed. Alarmed, the US warned that if Nasser accepted Soviet arms, he would receive nothing from them. But Nasser, undeterred, firmly replied, "I will not bow to your Western threats. I will buy weapons from whoever I choose." Eager to see Egypt break away from Western influence, the Soviet Union quickly and almost unconditionally provided 80 to 100 jet fighters, 30 to 45 Il-20 light bombers, 100 Stalin and T-34 tanks, and hundreds of other arms. The cost of these arms was to be paid over the coming years in Egyptian cotton and rice, with no additional conditions attached, amounting to an estimated value of $90 million to $200 million. The British were thrilled, believing that the Americans would now have to intervene. After Nasser aligned with the Soviet Union, the US withdrew its promised $56 million loan for the Aswan Dam, and the UK also retracted its $14 million loan. The Soviet Union quickly stepped in, offering a £100 million loan and promising to provide experts and technology to complete the dam. Nasser's commitment to the Soviet Union deepened. On May 16, 1956, Egypt became the first Arab country to establish diplomatic relations with the newly founded People's Republic of China. This move unsurprisingly infuriated the British, who compared Nasser to Hitler and claimed the Suez Canal was akin to the Rhineland. They argued that if left unchecked, it would not only harm Britain but also endanger the entire Western world by handing economic control to the Soviet Union. This exaggerated rhetoric was meant to stoke American fears. Analysts calculated that even if Egypt completely blocked the Suez Canal, the annual loss to Britain would be around $600 million, far from catastrophic. As Sadat predicted, war soon erupted. On Monday afternoon, October 29, 1956, Israel, backed by the UK and France, launched an attack on Egypt. The brutal conflict lasted until December 22, 1956, ending only when the British pound collapsed and the United Nations intervened. This conflict, known as the Suez Crisis or the Second Arab-Israeli War, marked a significant turning point. Egypt suffered another devastating defeat, losing thousands of soldiers. Port Said and the Sinai Peninsula fell into the hands of the British and Israelis. In a desperate attempt to defend Egypt, Nasser ordered the sinking of 47 ships in the Suez Canal to block it, destroyed 3 oil pipelines supplying the British and French, and armed civilians with 40 rifles for a final stand. However, the war's impact on Egypt went beyond physical damage, affecting its economy and social structure. The British managed to reframe the colonial issue in Egypt and the Middle East as an ideological conflict, drawing the region into the Cold War and making it one of the most brutal battlegrounds. Amidst this turmoil, Nasser's intense hatred of colonialism peaked. His strong sense of mission elevated him to a saint status among millions of Egyptians, though he might not have grasped the ancient Chinese saying, "As long as the sage lives, the great thief will not perish." To solidify his anti-Western stance, Nasser led Egypt to fully adopt a Soviet-style planned economy from the 1960s onwards. Following the nationalization of the Suez Canal, numerous industries and businesses were quickly brought under state control. This extreme egalitarianism made it more desirable to be a worker than a manager and more honorable to be poor than rich. It was during this period of implementing egalitarianism in the 1960s that Al-Fayed left Egypt. After Nasser came to power, Egypt saw 2 waves of capital flight and wealthy individuals leaving the country. The first wave occurred in 1956, following the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which triggered a massive exodus of foreign investments, comprador capital, and wealthy individuals. The second wave happened in 1961, when Nasser pushed for a planned economy and further nationalization, leading to the confiscation of assets from tens of thousands of capital tycoons and the disenfranchisement of the wealthy. Even minor wealthy individuals like Al-Fayed couldn't avoid having their fortunes seized. Osman, a construction magnate awarded the First-Class Order of the Republic for building the Aswan Dam, also faced this fate. The consequences of these actions are well known. While large projects like the Aswan Dam can be rapidly constructed, and heavy industry can thrive, the standard of living declines, and national debt accumulates. During Nasser's more than 10 years in power, Egypt's economy faced severe fragilities and mounting socio-economic difficulties, teetering on the edge of collapse. The Americans observed this with amusement, with one report stating, "Let Nasser keep shouting. Soon, they will be begging for mercy due to economic reasons." In 1960, half of Egypt's cotton crop was decimated by pests, foreign exchange reserves plummeted to a mere £10 million, and the country had to borrow $1.5 billion from international sources. Swallowing his pride, Nasser requested 200,000 tons of food aid from the United States. In a desperate plea to Kennedy, Nasser wrote, "You cannot understand the difficulties I am facing now. You may send a trusted advisor to inspect the crowded offices of the Egyptian government." That same year, Egypt launched its first 5-year plan, aiming to balance the budget and reduce reliance on foreign debt. However, by the end of the 5 years, Egypt's total deficit had not decreased but instead swelled to £413 million, with an annual trade deficit of £50 million. Despite the economic decline, Nasser's political ambitions continued to grow. After reclaiming the Suez Canal, Nasser envisioned leading a coalition of Arab nations to form a united Arab state under Egypt's leadership, breaking free from the dominance of the US and the Soviet Union. This grand vision extended Egypt's nationalism into Pan-Arabism. The problem was that Egypt itself was still weak, so how could it lead others? Moreover, many Arab countries couldn't unite. This contradiction between his intense belief and insufficient strength defined the last 10 years of Nasser's life. Tragically, Nasser could never let go of his obsession with Pan-Arabism. In March 1965, at the age of 47, he was re-elected president with an astounding 99.99% of the vote. British journalist Stevens, who visited Cairo to interview him, wrote with sorrow, "The once vigorous and enthusiastic young man I met 9 years ago is now a slow-moving, physically weak middle-aged man." Despite the long-term work pressure, Nasser's political passion remained undiminished, but it was clear he sought peace and relief from relentless difficulties. His challenges mainly stemmed from 3 areas: the lack of unity among Arab nations, Egypt's internal power struggles, and its own inherent weaknesses, particularly his ongoing power struggles. At 47, Nasser still had time to address these issues, but the sudden onset of the Six-Day War shattered all his dreams. The war began at dawn on June 5, 1967, with Israel launching a preemptive strike. Utilizing nearly all of its 360 combat aircraft, Israel attacked, and within just 3 hours, Egypt had lost the war. With precise intelligence, the well-trained Israeli Air Force launched a surprise attack on Egyptian air bases in the Sinai Peninsula, devastating 286 of Egypt's 340 aircraft in a single blitz. 10 minutes after the forward airfields were attacked, the Egyptian commander received the intelligence. However, Nasser, as the supreme commander, wasn't informed of the true situation until 4 p.m. that day because frontline soldiers only reported positive news. The commander blamed the British and Americans for supplying Israel with fighter jets that were 3 times more powerful than normal, causing Nasser to misjudge the situation again. He assumed that the British and Americans were directly involved in the war, leading him to divert his focus to launching a new wave of anti-British and anti-American propaganda and collaborating with other nations. With air superiority lost, the Egyptian army quickly found itself at a disadvantage, suffering heavy losses of 7 divisions on the first day alone. Communication lines were severed, supply routes were intercepted, and defensive positions were repeatedly breached. General Amer had no choice but to request a retreat from Nasser. However, as soon as the order was issued, several disorganized Egyptian units began a chaotic retreat through the Sinai passes, resulting in stampedes. The situation worsened when Israeli airstrikes caused further massive casualties. Seeing the chaos, Amer canceled the retreat order, leading to even more confusion and disarray. The large-scale war lasted only a week, bringing the Third Arab-Israeli War to an end. Egypt lost nearly all of its air force and 80% of its ground forces. Israeli troops occupied the entire Sinai Peninsula and controlled the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. 15 years of Nasser's hard work were destroyed in an instant. He nearly turned gray overnight. All his pride, glory, and confidence, along with his spirit and health, vanished with the end of the war. The proud lion of Africa could not understand why the Arab world couldn't rise. Back in 1958, after reclaiming the Suez Canal, Nasser's reputation soared, and he was hailed as the sole leader of the Arab world. He relished this vanity, eagerly attempting to establish the United Arab Republic. However, most Arab countries only paid lip service, with only Syria and Yemen genuinely joining. Iraq and Jordan also showed some interest. The United Arab Republic, despite adopting a unified flag, encountered significant challenges and numerous problems. Many Arab countries at that time, such as Saudi Arabia and Yemen, were monarchies, fundamentally differing from Nasser's republican ideology, making integration difficult. Nasser's insistence on a planned economy and the nationalization of banks and enterprises led to the withdrawal of even the most willing participants like Syria. By 1961, with the successive exits of Syria and Yemen, the United Arab Republic was essentially defunct. This marked the first setback in Nasser's dream of Pan-Arabism. On September 26, 1962, Yemen erupted in civil war. A group of young officers, inspired by Nasser's earlier actions, staged a coup and overthrew the Imam's theocratic monarchy. Nasser quickly sent troops to support these young officers. The Yemeni Imam, Muhammad al-Badr, had just inherited the throne. The revolutionaries first attempted to assassinate him, but they failed. The revolutionaries then used tanks and cannons to bombard his palace and seized the radio station. However, when everyone thought al-Badr had perished in the palace rubble, he escaped to the mountains, rallied thousands of supporters, openly confronted the revolutionary government, and declared himself the rightful ruler. Nasser and the revolutionaries continued their brutal campaign against al-Badr's supporters. What Nasser didn't realize was that his actions had instilled fear and resentment in many, especially the Saudi monarch, who feared that the revolutionary wave would spread to Saudi Arabia. The British had a military base in Aden, Yemen, and once considered establishing an independent kingdom there. Naturally, they opposed the revolution, fearing the revolutionaries might seize power and expel them. This situation meant the Imam of Yemen had the backing of Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, while the Soviet Union supported Nasser and the revolutionaries. What began as a civil war quickly escalated into an international showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nasser, who had rashly intervened, initially thought providing some weapons, funds, and a few advisors would quickly resolve the conflict. However, he soon found himself deeply entangled, and it wasn't until the United Nations intervened in June 1963 that he managed to extricate himself. This episode severely damaged Nasser's reputation. Once seen as a progressive revolutionary leader, he was now viewed by the West as a petty tyrant of the Arab world. This was another blow following the failure of the United Arab Republic. No sooner had one issue been dealt with than another arose. At the end of 1963, Israel planned to divert part of the Jordan River to irrigate more of its territory. This move would adversely affect downstream countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, who naturally opposed it. Initially, this issue had nothing to do with Egypt, and Nasser was hesitant to get involved. However, other Arab nations insisted, arguing that if Israel diverted the river, it would attract more Jews and further encroach on Palestinian land. Reluctantly, Nasser found himself thrust into the role of Arab leader once again. Nasser knew that his so-called allies were merely putting him in the line of fire. But if he did nothing, how could Egypt maintain its leadership in the Arab world? As expected, it became a thankless task. Nasser complained, "Everyone talks about joint military action, but they're all afraid of letting foreign troops pass through their territories." He soon discovered that some advocated for war, while others sought peace, resulting in negotiations often being overtaken by ongoing conflicts. In late October 1966, encouraged by the Soviets, Syria supported the Palestinian armed group Fatah and made the first move. Meanwhile, Jordan accused Nasser of cowardice for not confronting Israel. Nasser responded, "Fine, I support military action. But first, can Jordan allow Egyptian, Syrian, and Iraqi troops to operate freely on your territory?" Jordan fell silent. Reckless Syria was pummeled by Israel, while Jordan continued to mock Nasser. Thus, a tragic chapter unfolded. Before resolving inter-Arab cooperation issues, Egypt hastily took action, starting with two drastic measures: banning Israeli ships from the Gulf of Aqaba and demanding other Arab nations to follow suit. This strait was Israel's vital access to the Red Sea, and blocking it was tantamount to a death sentence for Israel. Thus, war became inevitable, and Egypt, which had no direct involvement initially, found itself at the forefront. A week before the war, Nasser was led to believe by his subordinates, "We are now very strong and can definitely defeat Israel." He never could have imagined that the Egyptian army would collapse within 3 hours. The so-called Arab allies were as fragile as glass, shattering at the slightest touch and utterly lacking in combat strength. Iraq, for instance, merely paid lip service without sending a single soldier. Egypt's defeat in this war was absolute. But beyond the military loss, the most devastating blow was to Nasser's heartfelt dedication to the Arab cause, which was met with crushing humiliation and ridicule. His most fundamental beliefs crumbled. On the evening of June 9, 1967, a haggard and dazed Nasser appeared on television, his voice choked with emotion and breaking intermittently, solemnly announcing his resignation from the presidency. Nasser's sudden and shocking decision to step down left countless Cairo residents in tears, shouting, "Nasser, Nasser, don't leave us, we need you." Tens of thousands gathered at the Parliament building, chanting his name and vowing to take action against anyone who didn't support him. Nasser had led the revolution that overthrew the monarchy, ended British colonial rule, reclaimed the Suez Canal for Egypt, and built the Aswan Dam, which greatly benefited the country. He distributed land to ordinary farmers, built numerous factories and schools, and brought clean water and electricity to remote villages. He also introduced social security for workers, giving Egyptian civilians their basic dignity. As the founding leader of modern Egypt, Nasser undoubtedly deserved his people's admiration. How could the Egyptians bear to see such a leader disheartened and wronged? Thus, this tragic figure, with his battered body and shattered spirit, continued to face the failures and the task of rebuilding the nation. On June 11, former Egyptian Commander-in-Chief Ammar was arrested and held primarily responsible for the defeat. About 2.5 months later, this founding member of the Free Officers Organization died in prison. Meanwhile, around 150 others were held accountable, and Nasser's old comrades from the revolutionary days gradually distanced themselves from him. Only Sadat, who was relatively indifferent to power, continued to stay quietly by his side. By the summer of 1968, diabetes and excessive work had finally taken a toll on Nasser. He was sent to the Soviet Union for treatment, but the results were poor, leaving him unable to work for an extended period. By June 1970, 3 years after the war, Israeli forces still occupied the Sinai Peninsula, and the Suez Canal remained closed. Meanwhile, internal strife erupted again among the Arabs, with King Hussein of Jordan clashing with the Palestinian armed organization led by Arafat, leading to irreconcilable differences. At this moment, people once again thought of Nasser, who was now half dead from disease, defeat, and loneliness. On September 26, Nasser arrived in Amman, Jordan, on time. He earnestly persuaded Hussein and then pulled Arafat into a small room, reasoning and appealing emotionally. His staff noticed that the prolonged negotiations and tension had left him exhausted and urged him to rest. He replied, "People are suffering greatly. We are fighting against significant challenges." On September 28, on his way home after the talks, Nasser suffered a heart attack and passed away 3 hours later at the age of just 52. That evening, Sadat delivered the news, plunging the Egyptian people into deep sorrow once again. Men wept openly, while women covered their faces and wailed, unable to accept that their spiritual leader had passed away. "Nasser is not dead, he will never leave us, and we will never let go of his legacy." In the early 1970s, many wealthy individuals who had fled to various parts of the world began to return to Egypt. However, Al-Fayed, who had left in the 1960s, never returned and remained in London. Despite being viewed by the British as a fraud and an upstart, Al-Fayed remained indifferent to their opinions. In his attempt to penetrate the British upper class, he meticulously imitated their attire, speech, and behavior. Even his acquisition of Edward VIII's former residence carried a touch of flattery. He once told the New York Times, "A great emperor of a great empire gave up everything for the woman he loved. I am honored to have the opportunity to protect the house and belongings he lived in. These items are part of Britain's heritage and my second home." Al-Fayed even spent a fortune to hire the king's former personal valet to maintain and care for the villa and its over 40,000 items. It was perhaps this sycophantic behavior that finally allowed him to enter the British royal circle. As early as 1987, he had met Princess Diana at a polo match on Windsor Smith's lawn. By the 1990s, Al-Fayed's relationship with the British royal family had become quite close. He had a daughter named Camilla Fayed, who wrote a book about her playful interactions with Diana's sons, William and Harry. In 1996, when Diana announced her divorce, no one was more thrilled than Al-Fayed. He saw it as another chance to reclaim what he viewed as the British royal family's discarded goods. He urged his son Dodi to break up with his current girlfriend and pursue Diana aggressively. Before the tragic car crash, he had arranged a romantic trip for the young couple to the south of France. Dodi, a film producer who worked on the Academy Award-winning Chariots of Fire, would never have been able to get close to Diana without his father's wealth. Tragically, the car crash erased all their plans. In 2005, Mohammed Al-Fayed honored his son and Diana by commissioning a statue of them, which he placed in the hall of his department store. Ironically, despite all of Al-Fayed's efforts, he was never able to obtain British citizenship. His applications from 1995 to 1998 were all rejected. In 2022, Netflix released The Crown, portraying him as a money-obsessed figure, absurdly groveling at the feet of British aristocrats. In 1956, Nasser reclaimed the Suez Canal, declaring Egypt's complete liberation from colonial rule. His lifelong efforts were dedicated to seeking Egypt's dignity and self-reliance. He oscillated between anger and mockery towards the colonizers and showed no leniency towards those who fawned over them. However, Al-Fayed's story illustrates that while ending physical colonization may be straightforward, eradicating psychological colonization is much harder. Even before the Suez Canal War, Sadat had noted, "Today there are only two great powers in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union." Later, Kissinger remarked, "Before the Suez Crisis, Britain had already realized it must rely on America, but continued to act as a great power." This makes Al-Fayed's obsessive admiration for the former colonial master seem even more absurd. After the crushing defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War, Saudi King Faisal proposed an annual donation of £50 million to support the affected brother countries and suggested Kuwait donate £60 million. Although Nasser did not request compensation, Egypt still received an annual donation of £100 million, more than 10% above its war losses. This tradition gradually took hold, with Egypt leading conflicts with Israel while wealthy Arab oil-producing countries provided financial backing. This proposal marked a significant historical turning point. It showed that the Middle East's struggle with the West would no longer focus on the Suez Canal but rather on oil, which would become the region's trump card. When the Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, oil was used as a weapon for the first time and proved highly effective. From that point on, Egypt, which lacked abundant oil resources, no longer had a reason to be the leader, inadvertently creating a broader space for its survival. Perhaps more fortunately, Sadat, Nasser's successor, was no longer fixated on the illusion of pan-Arabism but instead pragmatically focused on Egypt's national interests. However, history is rarely straightforward. Just as weapons can be more than guns and knives, including canals and oil, colonization can extend beyond occupation and force, infiltrating through economic and psychological means. Egypt's path to breaking free from colonialism remains long and arduous, and Sadat faced an ongoing perilous game of life and death. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps us going. Thank you.